If you're interested in decoding the complexities of China's national security outlook and its military modernization, check out Takshashila's latest expert capsule course offering China's Defense in the New Era. Visit school.takshashila.org.in and enroll in the course today.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shreya, your host for today. India is a fast-growing, socially and demographically diverse economy. To tackle some of our most persistent structural challenges, we need not just ideas, but an entire ecosystem that supports innovation. Our topic for today is on patents, a critical pillar of innovation. Our first guest today is Mihir Mahajan, adjunct fellow at the Takshashila Institution. His research interests are competition policy, intellectual property, privacy, and microeconomics. We're also joined by Arindam Goswami, research analyst at the Takshashila Institution, working in the high-tech geopolitics program. Arindam researches innovation, AI, and high-tech geopolitics. I'm a staff program manager with Takshashila's 12-week GCPP. Thank you, Mihir and Arindam, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Shreya, for having us. Thank you.
So the motivation for today's podcast comes from the recent op-ed penned by both Mihir and Arindam in the Mint on the 2nd of October this year. We'll link it in the show notes for readers. But your piece offers a very cautionary perspective on any premature celebration of patent filing metrics as a mark for deep innovation and research. Because I mentioned metrics for the benefit of listeners, I'm quoting some statistics from your op-ed as well. Data from the Indian Patent Office shows that patent filings have risen in India from about 40,000 in 2013 to about 60,000 in 2023. The Indian Patent Office has also managed to reduce the average time taken to grant an approval from 8 years in 2013 to less than a year in 2023. And the overall growth in patent filings has been led chiefly by educational institutions, which went from 20% of all patent filings in 2013 to about 42% in 2023. Now, usually metrics are a go-to for any policy assessment, right? And these numbers make it seem like universities are really focused on research. But in your piece, you also talk about how there's little evidence that university R&D expenditure has gone up over the last decade during this time when they've doubled their share of patent filings. One example you quote is of Lovely Professional University, which filed over 1,400 patents in 2023-24, ahead of IITs at around 1,000 and NITs at around 500 patents. Without capital expenditure on research or salaries paid, this calls into question the quality of the IP these patents are filed on. Mihir, what do you know about this?
Thanks, Shreya. That's a great start. What I would like to kind of start with is introduce maybe to listeners the idea of what makes for a patentable invention and how that differs from academic research in general. So academic institutions and especially scientific and engineering departments of universities carry out a lot of research. You may have, all of us are familiar with physicists tinkering in their labs, or theoretical physicists or chemists who are essentially trying to understand the fundamental nature of matter, if you will, or biologists who are trying to understand how different organisms function, and so on and so forth. All of those things are attempts to discover the natural laws of how our world works. Those things, by definition, are not patentable. So, to kind of be clear that discoveries about how the world works, whether it's about the physical world or is it about the living world in terms of biological organisms, those discoveries are not by themselves patentable. So that's part one. So what is patentable is more driven by things that are enabled by fundamental science, but transformed into technology that is industrially useful. So the discovery of a drug, because you understand the way a particular infection works, you want to be able to treat it and you identify the cause as an organism and come up with a treatment that tackles an infection by that organism, the treatment is patentable, but not the understanding of the biological organism itself. So, in that sense, one should say that a lot of good quality scientific academic research is not eligible for patents. On the other hand, a lot of patents are industrially useful but may not be considered a breakthrough scientific innovation. And so, in terms of the universities in India having upped their patent count, we should be focusing on whether they are shifted their focus from fundamental science to applied science or technological breakthroughs, or whether this is being driven by other factors, as I'm sure we'll discuss.
That's right. This clarification has been useful in terms of applied versus fundamental sciences for me as well and for listeners as well, right? You also speak about in your piece about how there have been even the advertisements that come from universities have sort of messaging that talks about that includes patent count as something that they actively advertising also in terms of ranking. Arindam, anything to add here?
Right. So, I mean, coincidentally, this year's Nobel Prize in Economics has also gone to three individuals who have worked on the linkages between innovation and economic growth rate. So this episode is in that sense a very timely episode. And so I wanted to bring about one other perspective here. Recently, the Global Innovation Index 2025 results were also announced, and in that, India's ranking improved to 38th, right? And just like the data that you quoted at the start could lead to the erroneous belief that India is doing quite well when it comes to innovation and R&D, right? But these statistics hide fundamental structural weaknesses and failures of India's innovation system, right? I mean, if you look at the statistics that we see, it seems to be a gaming of the indices in such a way that the outputs that matter to that particular index are the ones that are targeted, right? So it's patent filing and the numbers that you can inflate there by filing as many patents as possible and not maybe patents granted, etc., right? Even there, if you look at India's performance, while India's overall ranking has improved a lot, it still ranks 86th in R&D collaboration with between higher education institutions and industry, right? And that's its lowest standing ever in this metric. So what sort of collaborations we need to have so that the research that happens in higher education institutions in India or universities can translate into commercial products or commercialization? That's something that we need to look at, right? And if we look at some of the other parameters on which India has scored well on in the GI index, we have scored high when it comes to IT services exports, right? We are ranked first globally, late stage venture capital deals and unicorn valuations. Now, these sometimes make me wonder, what are these really connected directly to innovation as such, right? India's IT services exports could also point to advantages that we have when it comes to labor arbitrage, right? So does it really showcase India well when it comes to innovation is something that we need to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, I also had a follow-up question on universities just filing this sort of really big number of patents as well, right? This is also considerable effort, no? I mean, it just, I'm unable to sort of also square off, apart from the whole sort of, ranking and just getting your name out, sort of a promotional aspect. I also don't see any sort of strategic long-term plan of industry partnerships that sort of coming out as, something that they're working towards. I mean, for universities which are already like very resource constrained in many ways, right? Especially in areas of research. Mihir, what do you think explains this sort of insistence on this very bureaucratic filing sort of an approach as opposed to quality research that may or may not be patentable?
Right, that's an excellent question because in public policy, as many of you will know, there are things that can be measured as outputs, and then there are things that can be measured as outcomes. So when it applies to patent numbers, you can say that the number of patent filings, the number of patents granted, are essentially outputs generated by the universities, whereas the nature of those patents in terms of their commercial use, licensing, allowing the university to reap licensing revenue from their research activities and kind of plug that back into R&D would be like a true outcome based metric, which says here's an Indian university that came up with a new technology that has seen commercialization and that has reaped licensing benefits to the university. So in that output outcome framework, we don't see the same kind of results that Indian universities have achieved. Meaning that while their patents count have gone up, and they're advertising this in their advertisements everywhere, that we have hundreds of patents and our scientists are innovative and so on. Nowhere can you find any report or any data around how much revenue this has helped the universities earn, or which businesses have found these useful and therefore gone and collaborated with the universities. As Arindam mentioned, the lack of collaboration between Indian universities and industries is worrying because it kind of points to the patents either being not particularly industrially relevant, which puts into question the very nature of why would you file a patent. Because unlike an academic publication where the scientist publishes it for the benefit of their peers so that they can learn and jointly advance science, a patent is not meant to be simply a publication. Yes, a lot of patents end up there, but the ideal goal is commercialization because if you look at it from the legal perspective, it's a negative right. It allows you to stop others from practicing the technology that you have invented and thereby kind of having a limited term monopoly on your technology. So if universities are getting these hundreds of monopolies through their patents, why are they not able to translate those monopolies that are legally granted into revenues is a mystery. And I would characterize that by saying that this is maybe a distortion of the whole system in along two different dimensions of incentives. So one is private universities in particular have emerged over the last 15 years or so in India. And unlike the IITs or IISc or even some of the traditional universities in India, which have their own brand names and recognition in the marketplace where they can attract students relatively easily, private universities have a challenge. I mean, one, they are charging higher fees than government institutions, which are usually offering subsidized fees. And second is they don't have the brand. So they are trying to use every trick in the book, as any business would, to kind of make themselves attractive to prospective students as well as to faculty. And one way of doing that is to advertise that you are really successful on various metrics, and patents is one of them. So I would say like that image building of private universities is something that patents counts are contributing to. The other is that over the last decades, I think around 2017 or so, the new National Institutional Ranking Framework came about, which is a kind of government standard for ranking universities along various dimensions. And one of the dimensions is related to research and patent counts in terms of filings, grants, licensing, all of those factors come into play. What universities possibly are trying to do is get a higher ranking in the NIRF framework that they can again kind of use to market themselves. And one of the simpler levers that you can pull is to file more patents. So I would say there are the secondary benefits of patent filing, namely brand building, advertising, and rankings, seems to be driving this more than fundamental aspects of patent monopolies leading to commercialization.
Mihir, I was thinking of one contrarian view that I've read about when it comes to patent filing and the focus on quantity right now that we have over quality. Is that a trajectory that most nations who start off on this journey have at the start? Is there any value to this argument that when a nation starts off or is trying to ramp up on its R&D investment, it's okay to have this focus on quantity versus quality, while as and when the mechanisms by which you evaluate these things improve, you'll see positive externalities coming out even out of this, right? So is there any, in your experience, is there any value to this argument?
That's an excellent question. So there's two parts to it, right? I mean, when an economy is undergoing a transformation from an agrarian to an industrial or from an industrial to a knowledge economy, obviously there have to be cultural changes in the workforce, and the workforce has to adapt to how the overall global markets function. And one of the things that we have learned from countries that are considered advanced is that innovation and R&D have contributed hugely to their economic growth and prosperity over the last several decades. And as we see the Eastern miracles, the countries that arrived at the growth stage slightly later, whether it is Japan or Korea or now China, they are becoming innovative in the later stages compared to, let's say, the parts of Western Europe or United States that have kind of higher innovation from earlier times. I think there is a little bit of merit in saying that the quantity is useful in the sense that if there is a aspect of building a culture around protecting intellectual property, now that's again not something that comes very easily to people who are not used to building intellectual property and deriving revenue and profits through essentially new discoveries. So to build that culture, it is important that our university professors, our industrial R&D centers, and as well as startups kind of learn about the system that is intellectual property, specifically patents. How do these function? What kinds of monopolies they grant? What kinds of things are patentable and will give you a commercial advantage? So yes, there is a learning phenomenon here. Is you learn by doing, and until you have done it yourself, you won't learn. So there is a little bit of a truth to that. But I would argue that the patent process is actually not that complicated, right? Our patent laws are pretty straightforward. They are in harmony with the patent laws around the world. And our businesses are globally plugged in many sectors. I mean, there's hardly a business sector in India, whether you take pharma or IT or telecom or AI or even a lot of industrial manufacturing. The Indian companies are no longer insulated. They are globally connected, and there is movement of workforce. There is conversation with customers. So already some lateral flow of information is happening where these businesses are becoming aware of the role intellectual property plays. I think the whole thing that you have to go through the patenting process multiple times to learn is maybe a very, very minor factor, in my opinion, of kind of building an IP culture. And again, like there are philosophical debates to be had about what kind of IP strategy or IP policy is adequate or appropriate for a developing country. But those are separate debates. And I think in terms of just the numbers that we are seeing, I don't think that is coming out of a particular national drive to promote an innovation culture. A lot of the educational institution related aspects seem to be coming more from the NIRF ranking and branding type of motivations rather than kind of saying, let's file 100 patents this year and kind of understand this. Because it's very rare also that the same inventor will come up with 10 or 20 or 50 patents over a period of a decade. A lot of scientists kind of would come up with 2 or 3 ideas in a year that are worthy of commercialization. So it's also not a game where you play it repeatedly and learn and improve over time. It's a game where you have to have the innovation first and maybe kind of learn to identify its commercial potential, which is very different from learning how to run the patent process.
Thanks, Mihir. I think we understand what you mean in that. I think for those of us who are sort of removed from the entire IP patent process, the sort of foundational simplicity of how you go about an invention and then sort of fumble around in the dark, so to speak, and then decide to patent it seems very foreign to the kind of approach that universities seem to be doing at present. This is extremely useful because I was going to follow up and ask if this was a case of sort of getting at the low hanging fruit of available inventions, but you've answered my question in that that's not how it works.
Yeah, I think there is one thing to be said though, like when you are trying to set up a new culture, you need to understand the new process. When a factory is trying to set up a new production line, it is typically well known that the early yield in that factory will be low. So if you're trying to, let's say, for example, you're in an automotive factory, you're setting up a new type of painting process. The first few doors that you paint with the new type of process are not going to come out right. You're going to have equipment calibration issues. You're going to have issues of how the workers handle equipment and apply the paint. You're going to have issues about the paint itself not having the right characteristics and so on. So every time you have something new in an industrial setting, there is a little bit of wastage and trial and error to begin with until you kind of stabilize and have a repeatable process. So there is some merit to saying one has to learn to file a few patents and go through the process of attempting to commercialize it to understand what works and what doesn't. But that is, while that is applicable more in the factory setting, every piece of IP is different and requires a different approach in the sense of whether this of valuation around commercial factors, valuation around determining whether it's patentable, also kind of trying to figure out where the market is. A lot of IP markets may not be in India. The innovation might be useful to a company somewhere else because India may not have an industrial sector in that area. So all this knowledge building needs to happen. But I don't think just running through the process is a good thing. In fact, to go back to Arindam's question, I think China is a case in point. About 25 years ago, China started filing a lot of patents. A lot of Chinese universities, Chinese companies, all motivated by rewards given by the state and subsidies given by the state, started filing lots of patents. And a lot of these Chinese patents were not of high quality at all in terms of their innovation. And they were filed under the utility model system, which has a lower threshold of patentability. And the argument goes that the initial decade during which they filed a lot of not particularly useful patents set up the Chinese for the kind of scientific leap that they have made in the last decade. I would argue the other way around. I would say that China was an industrial powerhouse and became much more so in the 2000s. They started running through and innovating, and maybe they did these utility models under the subsidies. But really, what changed is, if I'm not wrong, the total spend on R&D by China, whether it's universities, whether it's research institutions, whether it's Chinese companies, started going up. The caliber of the workforce that the Chinese were hiring in the R&D departments improved. And the rise in IP in China and the quality of IP coming out of China is mirrored also by the rise in the academic publications that they have. If you look at impactful scientific publications coming out of China, in the last decade or so, they have made a substantial rise in the rankings to the point that they are neck and neck with the United States and Europe in terms of just scientific publications. So that tells you that the culture of science has taken root. And obviously, IP will follow, because if you are doing good research, whether it's in fundamental science or in applied science will eventually come from fundamental science and you will have IP. But the fact that they did utility model patents and low value patents in 10 years ago, and now they're doing high value, I think has more to do with their spend and their R&D capabilities rather than them having run through the patent process thousands of times with inferior quality.
So they've made that strategic shift of more capital expenditure, you mean, and the increasing the quality of their R&D.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that the quality of research papers coming out of China, and you will also see over the last decade or so, there are industrial products coming out of China that are world class. So while earlier on Chinese were known as the manufacturing center or factory of the world, I think in the last 5 years or so, people are starting to refer to Chinese companies not simply as factory of the world, but also coming up with their own innovations. So, for example, in battery management technologies, China has come up with some important breakthroughs, and you can see that in electric vehicles and storage systems and solar cells and things of that nature, the Chinese are actually innovating. They're not simply manufacturing. And so there you see that there is some level of alignment between their scientific publications, their patent counts, their R&D spend, and the outcomes that we are seeing in terms of their industrial capability and products. So those four things seem to be in relative harmony, as opposed to kind of in our case where while our academic rankings have gone up, they have not gone up nearly at sufficient rate to kind of say that we will have a lot of a lot of patent counts that are of high quality.
So, Mihir, what could be another parameter or indication that we could look at to evaluate the innovation scenario, right? So, as we have written in our op-ed, there's that low number of global patent filings that originate in India, right? We don't have a lot of these patent filings in US, Europe, or Japan, or filings under the Patent Cooperation Treaty, right? So, does that help evaluate the quality of the patents being filed? Because those are more, firstly, the patents there cost more to file. So the low count of Indian entities with global patent filings, that shows something, right? And also the fact that these jurisdictions will be much more litigation prone, right? And that then shows how worthy that patent really is, right? So anything you want to add on that?
I think there are two parts to understand. One is that there can be IP that solves India-specific problems. There are technological problems or hurdles that may be India-specific, and Indian companies solve for those and obtain patents, and they primarily work in the Indian market. Therefore, global patents are not necessarily valuable. I'll give you an example. So, two-wheelers, for example, India is the largest market in the world, and we also have a very strong and robust export industry around two-wheelers. And we have had Indian entities filing patents on innovations around two-wheelers, various aspects of two-wheelers. we may kind of see that those patents don't get filed in the United States, where the two-wheeler market is very, very small and there's not as much commercial gain to be had for Indian entities. So one can understand in those domains, Indian entities not filing patents abroad. But overall, a larger trend around the world, whether it is a European company that comes up with new innovation, or a US university, or a Japanese research lab, and so on, the overall trend is that if an innovation is successful, then two or three things kind of are an indication. One is that the patent is accompanied by a startup spun out of the university, or by licensing of the patent to a commercial entity that is building a product out of that, or that has built a product out of that. And then when those commercial products succeed, it is pretty straightforward that a lot of those products will be sold in multiple markets around the world, and therefore need to be covered by patents in those markets, so that the monopoly over that product or that particular feature is protected by IP. So to me, that indication, the fact that Indian entities don't file abroad a lot, is both a function of sometimes the innovation being India specific and not worthwhile filing abroad, but a much larger portion would likely be contributed by them not being commercially successful or not being licensed actively by industry participants.
This includes a lot of feedback loops, right? Like to have a startup being formed and then to be licensed to become a product and then to be sold in multiple global markets. Your op-ed also talked about how filings by companies dropped from 40 to 20%. Would you say that some part of this ecosystem is also not functioning as well, like in terms of corporates, for example, they're with their poor R&D, for universities to also sort of get onto a higher level, like you mentioned with China?
I think the percentages can be misleading. It seems that the growth in university patent filings has caused the drop in the overall patent filing percentages of corporates. I think the industry in India is still filing a fair number of patents. The absolute counts are higher than they were a decade ago. The trouble there is that we don't see that accompanied by a substantial increase in R&D spend. So I think Arindam has the statistics on R&D spend by the private sector in India. But unlike many industrial economies where private sector R&D expenditure, which is the capital spend that goes into new innovation to that leads to patents, is much higher in many innovative countries with high patent counts than in India. In fact, in India, the government proportion of overall R&D spend is very high compared to the private sector or compared to the global peers. So what that tells us is that the industry in India is not spending enough on R&D that can increase their patent counts. And so it may be just a function of really the industry not seeing enough success stories out of patentable innovation, out of the patent monopolies that it gets, and therefore making a rational decision to not really up their patent counts. I would think that if there were success stories and IP driven businesses, as now we are starting to see out of many countries, there is absolutely no reason why Indian industry wouldn't be filing more.
Are there, Mihir, is this like a symptom of some deeper other structural problems, like which create their own vicious cycle? So could it be that India's growth model till now, after liberalization, has rewarded arbitrage rather than innovation, right? So Indian IT companies, for example, have succeeded through labor cost arbitrage. So that doesn't really provide them a lot of incentive to maybe focus on innovation. It could be market access that has helped pharma companies, or maybe protected markets in the pre-liberalization era, right? So could this be a thought in the minds of corporates in India, why as to why to invest in expensive, risky R&D when you can maybe license technology or reverse engineer products, or compete on price, right? So that is one thing that I was wondering about. And the second thing is whether the IP protection and enforcement structures in India, are they weak or are they sufficiently strong enough, right? So if companies want to invest in R&D, but they are not sure whether they'll be able to capture returns through patents, whether their IP will be protected enough, right? Does that sometimes hinder them from investing in R&D? So, any thoughts on that?
I would actually kind of take objection to the way you characterize innovation in the Indian industry. I think innovation is a broader concept than patents. So to give you an example, innovation can take place in a variety of different ways, and not all of those ways are necessarily protectable by a patent. A patent is kind of restricted to one, it has to be technological innovation. It cannot necessarily be a business process innovation. So, for example, cash on delivery is an Indian innovation, but it's a business method where it solves a problem that largely occurs in India of a lot of people pre UPI, especially not having digital payment instruments or not being able to pay digitally, were served by online e-commerce companies by cash on delivery. Now, that is definitely an innovative way of doing business, and that is not patentable. Or a lot of the innovation that happens in the Indian service sector, including the IT services sector, is related to organizing business, setting up teams in a particular way that efficiently kind of serves a global customer. A lot of that, I would say, is innovation. Maybe at the margins, it is business innovation. Sometimes it is also technology innovation in terms of simplifying how to set up an IT operation here or how to move an IT operation, which was based, let's say, somewhere abroad and now to a global capability center in India. So a lot of innovation does take place. The nature of that innovation is not compatible with IP laws, and therefore it cannot strictly be protected under patents. But don't mistake that innovation for that being for lack of innovation. What I would say though is that one difference in that innovation versus IP worthy or IP capable innovation is that that innovation is not offered legal protection of a legal monopoly. So once an Indian company comes up with a business process innovation such as a cash on delivery, other companies also kind of bandwagon on that and everybody builds that. Or as we have now seen, the speakers that announce the UPI payments again solves a very important problem for people, and that innovation has been copied all over the place. And every small shop nowadays, you can see that small speaker exists. That's innovation, but not patent worthy. So I would kind of characterize that question, Arindam, a little bit differently and say that Indian businesses are definitely innovative in different ways than product companies traditionally are. And therefore, their IP metrics don't reflect it as much. I think also being plugged into the global system means that they're solving customer problems and they therefore kind of are focusing their innovation where they're making money. And if they are profitable doing that, as they have been for several decades now, I think we shouldn't insist on every kind of business building an IP culture or patents. There are certain kinds of businesses, product businesses especially, that focus on IP. And maybe our businesses are not at that level yet in terms of most of our big companies. The second part of IP enforcement, and what I would say is that is actually where volumes and the IP culture matters. So the more IP licensing activity take place, the more disputes that arise between whether a patent should have been granted or not, whether a patent is infringed by a particular party or not. And those disputes are resolved through courts and through other legal mechanisms. There, I think we do have a fair bit of IP culture there, but it could be much stronger. I would just say that, but it's not a sufficient disincentive given the low costs of obtaining an Indian patent. I don't believe it's a sufficient disincentive to not file IP.
This is a very useful distinction, right, between business solutioning and then also what is patentable. That's absolutely valuable. Do you think, for example, like countries like South Korea, right, have been very strategic about in terms of their own national interest and then strategically focused on sectors like semiconductors, electronics, and automotive technologies to, in a silo, create the kind of feedback loops for that specific sector as opposed to a more broad based approach, and then get all of the stakeholders in line to this end, right? Do you think something like that, being a part of like India's innovation and industrial policy, will help to sort of, because a lot of these conversations are around culture, they're also about volume that will then enforce culture for everyone who doesn't know about this patent world, who isn't working in fundamental sciences and understands the sort of process involved? Do you think picking a few specific sectors and then operationalizing this culture in those sectors will not only help bring this ecosystem to life, but will also further our sort of global competitiveness in these sectors?
Yeah, I think some sort of focus does really help. I mean, if at all, there has to be governmental intervention, and we agree that resources are restricted, right? We don't have enough resources, then it helps to focus on a few sectors, get our research capabilities up in those sectors, and that can probably have spillovers. So I think, yeah, that helps. Yeah, Mihir, you anything to add to that?
So I think, Arindam, this is a point where you and I disagree on the innovation culture and the countries. So the countries that we were referring to as having focused on individual sectors or having kind of done focused efforts and them resulting in industrial innovation and IP. I think there is a fundamental difference if you are referring to a Korea or a Japan or a China. There are two or three fundamental differences in the societies, if you will, that affect the innovation. One is that all these countries had fundamentally very high levels of literacy by the early 1980s. Some of them sooner, but pretty much every Chinese citizen was literate as of the early 80s or mid 80s, whereas India is at least a decade and a half behind those numbers. And similarly, once you have a generation that is fully literate, the next generation tends to have college education or higher, and so on. And then a larger academic culture takes root. Whereas since India only hit that literacy mark much later, and our universities didn't evolve into the modern university ecosystem of like campuses and R&D labs and everything being integrated, we actually have a deficit in the fundamental supply chain of the innovation space, if you will, right? So in terms of the number of PhDs graduating in the fundamental sciences or in engineering or applied sciences, India's overall numbers may look similar to as a population percentage to other countries, but in terms of individuals that are capable of conducting research, having published scientific research in leading journals and so on, our scientific metrics lag way behind. So while focused areas can help, and countries, smaller countries like Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam with smaller populations were able to kind of take that sectoral focus and specialize either in semiconductor manufacturing or electronics manufacturing or in some cases assembly of electronic components and so on. With a population like ours and the diversity that we as a nation have to support, I believe it will be harder for us to take that path to kind of focus as a through policy on individual sectors and promote innovation that way. I think we still one need to make the fundamental repairs to our basic and higher education sectors to create a workforce that is capable of delivering innovation. And then second, to take accounting for our diversity, maybe there are a few sectors we could focus on, but this is not the right time for it.
So I was coming from the perspective that this approach has sort of helped India in the, say, nuclear sector, space sector, and maybe a bit in the pharma sector. I'm not sure, but in some sectors it has helped us, considering that the resources that we have are not unlimited, considering the level of development that we are at.
Again,
So
I think I have to disagree in the sense that India is not following, at least since 1990s, India is not following a state-led development and growth model, right? The Indian government or the Indian state in general has recommitted itself since 1990 to kind of opening up industrial sectors for private sector investment and manufacturing and so on. So for us to kind of a full 30 years later go and say that the state should kind of take the lead, similar to how it did in the nuclear and space industries way back, and kind of focus on sectors, I think it would be a wrong approach to innovation. I think state's resources are heavily constrained, and we have other issues that are kind of holding us back in the innovation space. I think the state's resources may be better focused on building the fundamental infrastructure rather than doing sectoral investment. I think sectoral investments will come automatically. India already is very successful at attracting venture capital. India is already successful in a lot of business innovation and a lot of startups in dedicated spaces. So there is availability of capital. I don't believe will be an issue if we start seeing success there. A government-led agenda for innovation, especially given our weak state capacity, would, in my opinion, not necessarily be a good policy approach.
right, right. But what about if you look at it from the perspective of the theory of diffusion of general purpose technologies, right? The theory that Jeff Reading has talked about, where could investments at top-down investments by the government in a few sectors lead to a diffusion of capabilities and talent across different verticals?
I guess we'll find out, because we are seeing in the recent years, more recently, this type of government-led approach. So I think we'll find out. I think the jury's out. We'll find out. I haven't got my hopes up with this.
Right. I mean, China also did it for the electric vehicles and rare earths, etc. Right. So maybe it might help. But yeah, we'll see.
This is a broader conversation about growth and innovation and which models work. And I think, as you were referring earlier, we should look at research from those Nobel Prize winning economists, as well as other models of innovation that have succeeded. I think India has shown one model of innovation around business processes, around setting up large teams, around building capabilities in the service sector before anyone else in the world had, right? Over the last 30, 40 years, our companies have shown that. So there's no reason for India to be not able to transition or also add IP-driven innovation to this mix. It's just that the jury's still out on how best to do that.
Right.
That's also, I think, a great time to end our conversation today. I think we're beginning to branch off to larger topics of innovation and growth. And while that's also so connected to this topic we're discussing, right, it's also, I think, a topic for another day. Mihir and Arindam, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I personally have learned a lot about just foundationally how patents work, the process that's taken, what sort of universities, what are the odds that universities and companies will file patents? I think it's often we're very mission mode in thinking like, oh, patents, not enough patents, or how do you then increase it? This has been rather counterintuitive in that, hey, but there is not a lot of scope for these kind of patents. We're often in a very business process kind of thinking, I think, at least a lot of us. And so this has been super eye-opening. I hope listeners have found value in this as well. Thank you again, Mihir, for joining us today and speaking about your op-ed and your learnings from working in this space. Thanks also, Arindam, for jointly speaking about your op-ed. This has been very valuable.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll be very interested in listener feedback.
Yep. Thanks, Shreya. Pleasure being here.
Folks, please share your feedback at contact@takshashila.org.in if you have thoughts about the podcast and what you've learned, and we'll be happy to sort of read that and listen to your feedback. Thanks again, folks.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.